Welcome back, everybody, to College Football Red Zone. As we find ourselves in the closing moments of the regular season, we're heading into Conference Championship weekend, and really one of the biggest questions that we have in over the course of the Conference Championship weekend is who is going to, in fact, be the 12 teams that are going to make the college football playoff, as well as like figuring out like some of the other things, as I don't know, maybe winning a conference championship as well. So in today's video, we're going to do that. We're going to talk about every single team that still has a shot at making the college football playoff, or in some cases for certain teams have already locked in a playoff appearance, as well as, for some of the other teams that, have a little bit more work to do. We'll dive a little bit into deeply in terms of those other teams as well. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video, man. If you do, make sure you go ahead and do a couple of things for me. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button as well if you do happen to be brand new. Really also appreciate your patience, as well as I haven't really produced any content over on YouTube in a while. We are readjusting to like getting back to working full time. I was on a furlough status for almost 2 months, so that's why you saw a lot more content on YouTube. Had to make that adjustment once again. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into it. And really looking at what we have going on in terms of the college football playoff, we have 19 teams that, in my opinion, still have a shot to make the college football playoff. But before we talk about those 19 teams, how about we go ahead and talk about 7 teams that we did recently see get eliminated over the course of this past weekend. So, those 7 teams, you are going to see them on your screen right now, and they are listed in alphabetical order. Starting with Arizona State. Arizona State, they needed to make the Big 12 title game in order to have a chance to get back to the college football playoff. They lost the Territorial Cup in what was a ranked matchup between Arizona and Arizona State. Because they lost that game, that's how we saw Arizona State end up getting eliminated. Georgia Tech was a little different. Georgia Tech was at a point where even if they won the Georgia game, I don't know if that was going to be truly enough to get themselves an at-large consideration. So they had to make the ACC title game at the very least in order to remain alive. That, of course, did not happen. We'll have Virginia and Duke playing in the ACC championship game, and we'll talk a little bit more about that situation in a moment. But for now, Georgia Tech also remains eliminated as of right now. The Michigan Wolverines needed that win against Ohio State. They might have needed to make the Big Ten title game. They would have had a very compelling case to get into the at-large field if they were able to beat Ohio State on their home turf. That did not happen, of course. So Michigan at 9-3. This is just a type of year where 9-3 was just not going to cut it in terms of making it as an at-large. Speaking of other teams that were 9-3, and in one case 8-4, Pitt at 9-3. Now Pitt controlled their own destiny a little bit. They needed either Virginia or SMU to lose, and they had SMU lose in their matchup against Cal. The thing is, Pitt did not take care of business against Miami. So that's how Pitt ends up being eliminated. They were not good enough to be an at-large. They're not making the ACC title game either. And then, of course, SMU. They lost against Cal. They control their own destiny. And so SMU ends up being eliminated as well because of the loss to Cal. Tennessee had a chance to maybe bolster its resume a little bit, maybe get into that top 15, get into a bubble conversation if they were able to beat Vanderbilt at home, but they were dominated in that second half by the Vanderbilt Commodores. And so for Tennessee, they are gone like a girl in a country song. Texas is the only team that has won, but is still eliminated anyways. For Texas, in the case for them, so for those that aren't familiar, I do vote in Redshirt Sports Top 25. I still had Texas at number 16. They did move up a couple of spots for me after the Texas A&M victory. The problem is there was not enough chaos around the country to get Texas into that legitimate bubble conversation. So Texas at 9-3, they are going to be eliminated. Some people point to, hey, maybe we should have played the Ohio State game and maybe would have had a better shot. How about not lose to Florida? Let's try there. Maybe not losing to a Florida team that not only is not going to a bowl game, but they also fired their head coach mid-season. So starting there, I think would be preferable. But those are the 7 teams that were eliminated this past weekend. And so now we get into the 19 teams that now remain alive. Let's go ahead and talk about the locks first. And in my opinion, I think there's 9 teams that are going to be locks for the college football playoffs, starting with 5 teams. Yes, 5 teams that are coming from the SEC. So, gonna start with the more obvious ones first. Texas A&M. Texas A&M at 11-1, even though they are not going to Atlanta. Texas A&M, finishing 11-1. That's gonna be more than enough to make the college football playoffs. So Texas A&M, I think they are definitely in, regardless of what happens this weekend, regardless of how the rankings look. Because I am recording this prior to the rankings that are going to lead up to conference championship weekend. I'm recording prior to that. So that's where I'm coming from that standpoint. Oklahoma and Ole Miss, both of these teams are in the top 10 as of right now as well. They are locked in as 10-2 teams in the SEC and are already ranked inside the top 10 for this college football playoff committee. The thing about Ole Miss, here's a really interesting tidbit about Ole Miss. We did see them lose their head coach, Lane Kiffin, taking most of his offensive staff over to LSU. Now, in one of the criteria, interesting enough, is the fact that, hey, you can consider, loss of coaches and loss of players in the rankings. However, because I disagreed with the fact that Florida State should have not been punished that severely for the Jordan Travis injury a couple of years ago. You also have to make the argument, especially because we haven't seen Ole Miss play without Lane Kiffin coaching on the sideline. I don't think Ole Miss should be punished for things that are frankly outside of their control. So I think Ole Miss, I think even with the Lane Kiffin hiring in that debacle, I think Ole Miss is going to be in. And then, of course, we got to talk about the 2 teams in the SEC championship game. Georgia, I think, is definitely going to be in. Alabama might be a little bit of an eye raise for some folks, as they're currently sitting at number 10 of the college football playoff rankings as of about the mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. Here's the thing about Alabama. So last year, when we were talking about SMU, and they lost the ACC title game to Clemson, there was a popular argument that just because that they played in their conference championship game doesn't mean if they lost, they shouldn't fall out of the college football playoff, because it creates the precedent that, hey, in certain situations, you might have been better off not playing in your conference championship game at home than you would if, let's just say, you did end up playing in that conference title game. And, for the sake of competition, that's not a healthy thing for the sport as well. Especially, in the case specifically for Alabama, you did beat Georgia earlier in the regular season. You're already, you finished higher in the SEC standings than Ole Miss, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, teams that I think there's a general consensus, hey, these 3 teams should be locked in the playoffs. So, regardless, I think what happens on Saturday in Atlanta, I think Alabama should be in regardless. That's why I have them as a lock. 3 teams from the Big Ten. This should be self-explanatory. Ohio State and Indiana. Both of these 2 teams are undefeated at this point. Regardless of what happens in Indianapolis, Ohio State, and Indiana, they're definitely going to get in. It's just a matter of, does the loser of the Big Ten title game, do they remain as a number 2 seed? I think we're talking about 2 teams that will definitively have a bye in the first round of college football playoff. Oregon, Oregon will be at least your 3rd team that we're talking about getting into the college football playoff. Their only loss was to Indiana, but Oregon does handle business the rest of their schedule. 11-1 in the Big Ten. That's more than good enough to make the college football playoff. And then Texas Tech. Texas Tech at 11-1. Their only loss was to Arizona State with a backup quarterback. They've dominated almost everybody else over the course of this season. So Texas Tech, even though they were competing in the Big 12 title game, I think regardless of what happens in that title game, whether they win or lose in Arlington, Texas Tech has to be in. So that's going to be your 9 teams that, in my opinion, should be locked into the college football playoff, which means there are 3 slots that are still to be played for in terms of making it to the college football playoff. So now we go ahead and jump into a lower tier where, these teams aren't locks yet, but if they win on Saturday, they will be a lock to make the college football playoff. Those 3 teams are BYU, Tulane, and Virginia. Um, Starting with Virginia, because I think a lot of what has been lost in the Duke conversation and what would happen if Duke wins the ACC title game, what has gotten lost in that ACC discourse is that Virginia has had an absolutely incredible season. One of the best seasons that Virginia has had in modern history, okay? So Virginia already has a lot to be to celebrate about. And Virginia, we're talking about them being one game away from making the college football playoff and competing for a national championship. So it's very simple for Virginia at this point. You beat Duke in the ACC title game. You're going to be in, and you're going to be in as an 11 seed. You're going to have to travel somewhere for a road playoff game, but for all intents and purposes, Virginia, you're going to be in as an 11 seed. Tulane is the same situation. Do I personally have Tulane as my highest ranked G5 team? No, I do not, but I do have to acknowledge that's what the committee has as of right now. So for Tulane, it's also a similar situation, even though they already lost their head coach, who's heading off to Florida. Tulane, if they beat North Texas in the American title game, Tulane is going to get in. We'll see if Tulane would be in as either an 11 seed or a 12 seed. That's going to be based upon what happens in the ACC title game. But you're looking at possibly Tulane making the college football playoff. They're game away. And if they get in, then, absolutely no problem. BYU, honestly, we should be talking about them as a lock. I think they've personally done more than enough to be a lock for the college football playoff. The problem is that the committee still has them outside of the top 10. So unless something happens tonight where BYU moves into the top 10, then they actually do need to win the Big 12 championship to make it into Arlington. Do I think that's fair on BYU? Absolutely not. I think they've done enough to prove that, hey, they are one of the best 12 teams in the country. They are one of the 12 deserving teams. But that's not the situation that the committee has put together as of right now. BYU, therefore, is going to have to win the Big 12 title game in order to get in. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the win and in. If these 3 teams were to win, then the 9 teams that you saw as your locks, that plus your win and in group, that's going to be your 12-team field for the college football playoff this year. So now we go ahead and get into, things getting a little bit spicier. The next tier that I have is the bubble tier. Now, this tier right here, for all intents purposes, they're staying at home and they don't control their own destiny. Their playoff fate lies in the hands of the playoff committee at this point, as well as what happens around the country on Saturday. So, those 4 teams are Miami, Notre Dame, Utah, and Vanderbilt. So, best case scenario is if there is a situation to where either Alabama loses or BYU loses, there might be an open slot for these 4 teams. As of right now, what we've seen from the playoff committee, that Notre Dame has that spot. However, with that being said, reason why I have a few other teams here on the bubble is Miami. They have a very legitimate argument to be ranked ahead of Notre Dame if you want to count the head-to-head. And then Utah and Vanderbilt. Utah and Vanderbilt are 2 teams that I think have played extremely good football over the course of the season. They're very deserving in their own right. I actually have them ranked ahead of Miami. So there's been a lot of talk about, whether it should be Notre Dame or should it be Miami. Gotta also have to include Utah and Vanderbilt in the conversation as well, because those two teams have been playing really incredible ball. And going back to the Notre Dame and Miami conversation, I could really see the argument for both sides. For Miami, it's fairly obvious. Miami beat Notre Dame in over the course of the regular season, and head to head should absolutely matter. I'm talking as somebody that values the eye test very heavily and values head to head very heavily as well, and that's how I designed my top 25. That being said, I understand why Notre Dame is still ranked ahead of Miami. Walk with me a little bit here on this one, okay? So, the biggest lie that you can tell in college football, one of the most casual statements that you can make, is that you are what your record says you are. And that when in reality, your record in a certain conference is different from a different schedule. Say, playing a G5 schedule versus playing a power conference schedule. Just talking in generalities, okay? So let's talk about Notre Dame's two losses versus Miami's two losses, okay? So Notre Dame, what we've seen from them, obviously, I don't think we need to overstate. They do have the loss against Miami, okay? We get that and we understand that. The other loss that Notre Dame has right now is to Texas A&M. Okay, so Texas A&M, we agree, is a lock. Was a very good season for Texas A&M at 11-1. So the two losses combined that Notre Dame suffered between Miami and Texas A&M, they lost by 4 points. So really like a ball bounce in a different direction either way. We're talking about Notre Dame at 11-1 or even Notre Dame at 12-0. With that being said, because those losses were so close against teams that are going to be ranked inside the top 15, you almost have to treat Notre Dame as an 11-1 football team. Now, if Notre Dame had that 11-1 record, no one's batting an eye about Notre Dame being included in the playoff field. Miami, on the other hand, while they do have the head to head over Notre Dame, at the same time, I think that the two losses are being held as a heavy anchor right now in the eyes of the committee. Forget eye tests, okay? If you want to say the eye test, that's one thing, but at this point, that shouldn't be the only thing that matters. But Miami's two losses are to Louisville. Louisville faded down the stretch, an 8-4 team who lost to Cal. They lost to Clemson. And then their other loss was SMU. SMU notably has a loss to Baylor. We saw them very recently lose to Cal as well. So while Notre Dame has two very high quality losses, Miami, on the other hand, doesn't have the same quality of losses. I think those two losses to unranked teams is really holding back the Miami Hurricanes. So with that being said, I actually understand why Notre Dame is ranked ahead of Miami, but I think the playoff committee is doing a very poor job of articulating that that reasoning and the logic behind why Notre Dame is ranked behind Miami, which is a big reason why they're getting a lot of hate right now, okay? So that's the Notre Dame Miami conundrum. And then Utah and Vanderbilt, talked about them already. Those are two teams that I have ranked ahead of Miami right now. If we're going to talk about Miami having a legitimate argument, you also have to acknowledge Utah and Vanderbilt as well. I think those are two teams that also in their own rights have very legitimate arguments in terms of making the college football playoff as an at-large team. Now, the last tier that I have right now is the tier where you're going to win out, but you not only do you need a win on Saturday or Friday, depending on when your conference championship is playing, you also are going to need a little bit of help. And these are two teams that are all going to need to get in by the purview of the auto buy or the auto bid that's promised to the top five ranked conference champions, which I think this week leading up to conference championship weekend has shown not everyone understands that just because you're a power conference champ doesn't mean you're guaranteed a auto bid, because it's not ordained to the power conferences automatically. It is the top 5 highest ranked conference champions. So there is always a possibility where you could have multiple champions from the group of 5 make your college football playoff. So, getting that out of the way, I have 5 teams here that, after I've thought about, do genuinely have a legitimate chance to make the college football playoff. All right, so those 5 teams are Duke, James Madison, Kennesaw State, North Texas, and UNLV. So for James Madison and North Texas, and again, I want to note that I'm recording this before the rankings are revealed leading up into conference championship weekend. Neither James Madison or North Texas are ranked in the top 25 right now. At the same time, I do think, with that being said, because they're not ranked, and they should be ranked in the top 25. They should have been ranked weeks ago, but because the committee hasn't ranked them as the recording of this video, I don't know how James Madison is viewed in comparison to North Texas. If the newest batch of rankings come out and North Texas is ahead of James Madison, then think of North Texas being in that win and ear tier. And that's that. For James Madison, on the other hand, what James Madison may likely need, depending on if James Madison is behind North Texas, what James Madison would need is they need Duke to beat Virginia. If Duke beats Virginia and James Madison wins the Sun Belt title, then James Madison, I think, would have a very real argument to get in, because at that point we're talking about 12-1 James Madison versus an 8-5 Duke team, okay? And while Duke is going to have a ranked win on its resume to end the season, the losses eventually have to matter. And Duke having significantly more losses than James Madison, I do think James Madison would get the nod. But then there's also a couple more teams in the G5 that aren't necessarily being talked about, and it's a little bit more of a long shot, but I think would get serious playoff consideration if it were to go down. We'll talk about UNLV first. So UNLV, not as much needs to happen here, okay? So for UNLV to get in, one, they need to win the Mountain West title. They're taking on Boise State. They're playing Boise State on the road for the Mountain West title game. First things first for UNLV, they need to win that. And then, not only do they need Duke to beat Virginia, but then you also need Troy, the Troy Trojans, to beat James Madison on the road for the Sun Belt title. At that point, I think UNLV will be viewed in a higher light than Troy, the Sun Belt champion. And I also think that UNLV would also be seen a little bit more positively than Duke as well. So for that, I think an 11-2 UNLV would be in ahead of 8-5 Duke. Then we get Kennesaw State in here. And for Kennesaw State, it gets really interesting, okay? Because for Kennesaw State, not only do they need Duke to beat Virginia, not only do they need Troy to beat James Madison, not only do they need Boise State to beat UNLV, but then they got to win the Conference USA Championship. And even if all that happens, I don't know what's going to go down between Kennesaw State and Duke. I don't know how the committee would lean, because they've already shown that they're willing to rank a 3-loss ACC team over a 1-loss American Conference team. For me personally, I would rank Kennesaw State ahead of Duke if it was between Kennesaw State and Duke. But again, I don't know if it would go down that way. I just wanted to acknowledge that. And then, of course, Duke would need they would need quite a bit to happen to make the college football playoff at this point. First, they got to win. And even then, I think Duke, at best, you're going to get a 12 seed. You need James Madison to lose, you need UNLV to lose, and you might also need Kennesaw State to lose. But guys, that is going to be your 19 teams that are still alive heading into conference championship weekend. Definitely let me know what you guys think down below in the comments section. And with that being said, hopefully you guys enjoy this conference championship weekend. This is Jake from College Football Red Zone signing off. But hopefully you guys hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you have to be brand new as well. Would truly appreciate it. And again, this is Jake from College Football Red Zone signing off. Hope you guys are all out there having a good one. Take care, everybody.